The story you've heard of the Crusades may not be the whole story. Behind the clang of swords and the march of armies, there are whispers of a quieter power, an order of knights who were monks, and monks who were bankers, sworn to poverty yet guardians of treasure, bound to obedience yet accused of heresy. They were called the Knights Templar. Some say they were protectors of pilgrims, others wonder if they were architects of something greater, an invisible empire woven not of steel but of parchment, seals, and stories. Tonight, we walk slowly into their world, through the bloodied stones of Jerusalem, through fortresses that watch trade and armies alike, through the papal bulls that wrap them in law, and through the trials that wrap them in fire. We will follow them not to prove, but to wonder, to linger in the mist where fact and legend blur, and to ask, who truly controlled the Crusades? This is Serene Myths. If you'd like more journeys told in this quiet way, you're welcome to like, subscribe, and even leave a comment with the time on the clock where you've joined us tonight. It's a way of marking where in the long forest of history we've met. And now the bells begin to toll. Let us step back to Jerusalem to the summer of 1099, where the stones of the holy city ran red, and a new order of knights began to rise. The summer air over Jerusalem in July of 1099 was heavy with dust and heat, and the city had already endured weeks of siege before the Crusaders finally broke through its gates. Chroniclers describe the moment as if the world itself had cracked open. They wrote that the clang of steel against stone echoed in every alleyway, that church bells tolled in distant Europe as though in eerie anticipation, and that the streets of the holy city ran red. Some said the blood reached to the knees of soldiers, a detail that has always seemed both impossible and unforgettable, a flourish that may be more symbolic than literal. Whether or not it reached such a flood, there is no doubt that the conquest was soaked in violence, its aftertaste lingering like acrid smoke drifting through a deep forest after a wildfire. The fact of the conquest is solid enough. The First Crusade, called by Pope Urban II only a few years earlier in 1095, had culminated in this moment. The capture of Jerusalem after nearly 4 centuries of Muslim rule. For the Crusaders, it was a triumph charged with apocalyptic hope, the restoration of a sacred city. For the inhabitants of Jerusalem who were not Christian, it was a catastrophe. Mosques were desecrated, synagogues burned, and the entire urban rhythm was broken apart. The city that should have been a meeting place of prayer became instead a slaughterhouse. The sensory picture of that July, dust, sweat, heat, and the clanging of metal on flesh, burned itself into the medieval imagination. And yet, alongside this horror, the first odd, almost quirky detail emerges. Among the Crusader ranks, there were men who carried not only swords, but also strange tokens. Little palm leaves tucked into belts, pebbles taken from the Jordan River, even bits of cloth soaked in what they swore was holy oil. These men believed that by collecting such objects they could carry a piece of the sacred with them. Some of the pebbles even ended up sold in markets years later, talismans hawked like relics from a grim fair. This mingling of the brutal and the devotional, the sword raised high, while the hand grasps a souvenir pebble, captures the paradox of tenin nita sinin perfectly. But here is where debate seeps in like evening mist. Were the reports of blood so exaggerated that they became propaganda, serving as proof to audiences back home that God had truly intervened? Or were they sober attempts at describing chaos beyond words? Some scholars argue that the blood to the knees line was lifted straight from the Book of Revelation, a way of making history sound like prophecy fulfilled. Others suggest it was a metaphor for streets simply full of corpses and gore. The uncertainty itself is telling. Medieval chroniclers were not journalists in the modern sense. They were often more concerned with the moral message than the factual detail. And so, for the listener today, one must wade carefully through this fog of testimony, separating what is certain from what is imagined, what is history from what is sermon. In this first moment of conquest, we already glimpse the fragile order to come. The Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a precarious Christian realm surrounded by enemies, propped up by knights and pilgrims, and bound together by a sense of divine mission. Yet even at its height, it was never truly secure. Every caravan needed protection, every road could be ambushed, and every fortress was a bulwark against anxiety as much as against armies. It was in this climate that whispers began of a new kind of guardianship, something different from the noble lords who fought for their own estates. What if there could be warriors who held no personal lands, who claimed only the mantle of poverty, who vowed themselves not to family or fortune but to the safeguarding of pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem? Hear the motifs circle again. Imagine walking the narrow lanes of the city at dusk in 1100 or 1101. The clang of steel had quieted, but its memory hung in the air. The bells of hastily consecrated churches tolled at uneven hours, calling the faithful to prayer. The streets smelled of dust and charred timber, but also of incense, sharp and sweet. The city was alive again, yet unsettled, like a forest after a storm, branches cracked, roots exposed, everything waiting for a new balance. In that unsettled silence, the idea of 9 knights pledging themselves to a higher cause did not seem impossible. In fact, it seemed urgently necessary. But before we reach those 9 knights, it is worth pausing on what was born in 1099. For all the contradictions, Jerusalem became a stage where Europe projected its anxieties and its ambitions. It was not merely a military conquest, but also a spiritual performance. Pilgrims wrote of seeing angels on the walls, of hearing choirs where none sang, of bells ringing in places where no tower stood. Whether hallucinations, embellishments, or genuine mystical experiences, these reports reveal how blurred the line was between physical reality and spiritual imagination. To live in Jerusalem in those years was to live in a story constantly being rewritten by the hands of monks and warriors alike. Some of those same reports mention a quieter figure, a priest, or sometimes a monk, who walked among the corpses with a bowl of water, touching lips of the dying so they might feel moisture once more before the end. The chronicles do not preserve his name, but the image of a man pouring out water while the city drowned in blood is unforgettable. Perhaps he never existed. Perhaps he was invented as a symbol of mercy amid carnage, but the detail lingers like a candle flame in the mist. And so, as the first decade of the 12th century opened, Jerusalem stood as both triumph and wound. The clash of steel had secured the walls, but securing the soul of the city was a different matter. It needed guardians of a new kind, men who would not simply swing swords in battle, but who would embody the paradox of being both monk and knight. The road to that paradox began here, on stones still slick with memories of conquest. The motif of the deep forest comes quietly into focus now. A forest is not only a place of trees, but also a place of shadows, of secrets, of things hidden beneath leaves. Jerusalem after 1099 was a kind of forest of stone, its alleys winding, its houses stacked like trunks, its hidden chambers echoing with secrets. Beneath the surface, something was germinating, something that would grow roots so deep it would one day stretch across Europe. But for now, all one could hear was the hush after battle, the echo of bells fading into dusk, and the silent vow that new guardians would soon rise. And as the night deepened over Jerusalem and torches flickered along the walls, the story turns its gaze from the chaos of conquest toward the quieter, stranger tale of 9 knights gathering by the Temple Mount, preparing to bind themselves with oaths of poverty and silence. The steel of the city's conquest was being put away, sheathed, but another kind of steel was about to be forged, one tempered not by battlefields, but by vows whispered in the cloistered dark. When the clamour of conquest settled, and the kingdom of Jerusalem took shape, the city entered a quieter, but still precarious rhythm. The clang of steel was no longer the thunder of armies at the gates, but the hum of blacksmiths reshaping broken swords into plowshares, of guards pacing the walls, of craftsmen repairing beams cracked in the siege. Bells tolled in newly consecrated churches, not in triumph this time, but in routine, marking hours of prayer. The air in the city still carried that uneasy mist of both victory and vulnerability, and within this charged atmosphere emerged a story that began not with kings or bishops, but with 9 men. Around the year 1119, these men came forward under the leadership of Hugues de Payan, a knight from Champagne in France. Their mission, so they declared, was deceptively simple: to protect pilgrims travelling to and from the Holy City. Roads from the coast were treacherous, plagued with bandits and sudden raids, and the flow of pilgrims was as much the lifeblood of the kingdom as trade caravans. That such a mission was needed is a plain historical fact. Pilgrimage was not only devotional but also economic. Inns, markets, relic sellers, and entire villages thrived on the movement of travellers. Safeguarding that flow was essential to keeping Jerusalem alive, and yet the circumstances of these 9 men were peculiar. They called themselves poor, so poor that legend says they shared horses, 2 knights riding on one steed, a symbol later immortalised in their seal. It was an image that spoke volumes, a fraternity of poverty, a fellowship stripped of vanity. But here comes the quirky layer. The kingdom was not exactly devoid of resources. Baldwin's sect, king of Jerusalem at the time, offered them lodging not in some humble hut on the city's edge, but within the royal precincts of the Temple Mount itself. They were given quarters near the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders had rechristened the Temple of Solomon. So these so-called paupers lived in what was arguably the most sacred and symbolically charged piece of real estate in the entire city. Poverty had seldom been housed in such opulence. From the outside, this contradiction must have seemed puzzling. How could 9 knights, supposedly sworn to poverty, be stationed in chambers that once belonged to caliphs and kings? How could men with so little be given access to a site layered with centuries of sanctity, mystery, and political importance? It is here that the fog of uncertainty drifts in. Were these knights truly there only to protect pilgrims, or was another purpose unfolding beneath the cover of their vow? Some chroniclers wrote of them simply as guardians, unarmed shepherds of the faithful, brave but humble. Yet later rumour suggested something more hidden. Why, skeptics asked, did the records of their early years seem so strangely blank? Nearly a decade passed before they stepped fully into the light of history. For 9 years, there is silence. No recorded battle, no detailed ledger, no public roll. To later generations, this absence of evidence invited speculation as thick as smoke curling through a deep forest. The debated point is whether those years of quiet were simply a reflection of obscurity. They were, after all, a small and unremarkable band at first, or whether they were deliberately concealed because something was happening under the Temple Mount. Theories abound that they were excavating forgotten passages, searching for relics like the Ark of the Covenant, or unearthing documents that could change the balance of power. Skeptics dismiss such tales as later inventions, fueled by medieval fascination with hidden treasure and modern imagination with conspiracy. Supporters point to faint references in travellers' diaries, whispers of tunnels wide enough for pack animals, strange movements of soil. The truth remains out of reach, caught in that liminal space between history and legend. What is certain is that their very name tied them irrevocably to the temple. They were called the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, Knights of the Temple, or simply the Templars. This was more than a label. In the medieval imagination, names carried weight. They defined purpose, invoked legitimacy, and wrapped men in stories larger than themselves. To be of the Temple of Solomon was to draw upon the mythic authority of the Old Testament, to stand as heirs to sacred architecture and divine wisdom. Whether they intended it or not, the knights were already cloaked in a symbolism that made them more than just armed escorts, and in the daily life of Jerusalem they would have been noticed. Imagine a pilgrim arriving weary at the city gates. The streets buzz with vendors, the smell of baked bread mingles with dust, and overhead the bells call the hour. Amid the crowd, a group of knights in plain habits, no gilded armour, no bright banners, moves with deliberate calm. They do not swagger like mercenaries, they walk with the solemnity of monks. To a pilgrim, they must have seemed both reassuring and uncanny. Protectors who looked like penitents. Quirks of their presence ripple through stories. Some say they kept their horses so thin that they resembled the poor travellers they defended. Others say they refused to eat meat on certain days, mimicking the austerity of monks, though still carrying swords at their sides. It was a strange sight. Steel harnesses gleaming faintly even as they bent their heads in prayer. Bells called them to chapel, but bells also sent them galloping out to guard a caravan. This dual identity, part cloister, part cavalry, was as novel as it was disquieting. Debate continues about Baldwin's motives in housing them so prominently. Was he simply generous, impressed by their sincerity, or was he calculating planting them near the Temple Mount for reasons unspoken? Some historians suspect he saw in them a political tool, a way to secure not just roads but also the narrative of sacred guardianship. If the king could anchor their presence in the temple itself, he could wrap his fragile kingdom in the aura of biblical legitimacy. Others argue that Baldwin had little foresight and merely gave spare rooms to men without means. Once again, the line between fact and speculation blurs, and mist settles over the scene. What is undeniable is that from this humble beginning, a handful of knights lodged in a chamber near the most contested site on earth. An institution would grow that rivaled kingdoms, challenged kings, and haunted legends. But in these first years, it was all potential, a seed buried in uncertain soil. The sound was not yet of armies marching, but of quiet prayers whispered in stone halls, the shuffle of boots in dusty corridors, the faint ring of steel being polished by candlelight. As the second decade of the 12th century advanced, the 9 knights continued their obscure vigil. Pilgrims came and went, some safely, others still falling prey to raids. The Templars were there, but their role remained more rumour than headline, and so, the city, still wrapped in its contradictions of blood and sanctity, awaited the moment when these 9 men would step fully into history's light. For now, they linger in the shadow of the temple, half remembered, half forgotten, their lives caught between stone walls thick with prayer and chambers heavy with silence. The bells of Jerusalem rang on, the mist of uncertainty swirled around their quarters, and the deep forest of rumour grew thicker with each passing year. And in that silence, one question grew like a whisper carried by wind through trees. Were these knights truly what they claimed to be? Poor guardians of pilgrims? Or were they tending something hidden? Something that would one day reshape the very architecture of power? The story drifts forward now, into that span of years where no record speaks and speculation runs wild. 9 years of silence that would later give birth to the strangest transformations. The mist deepens, and we step quietly towards section 3, where we explore what those years of silence might have concealed, and what kind of steel was being forged in secret beneath the temple stones. The years that followed the founding of the Knights of the Temple unfolded in a strange hush, as though history itself had decided to hold its breath. From roughly 1119 until 1129, nearly a decade slipped by with barely a whisper of these 9 men in the chronicles. It is this absence, this mist of silence, that has invited so much speculation. For while the clang of steel was still heard on distant frontiers where Crusader lords fought to defend their fragile holdings, the chambers near the Temple Mount were curiously quiet. What then were these so-called poor knights doing, hidden away in the most symbolically charged location of Jerusalem, while the rest of the kingdom trembled at its borders? The fact, plain and firm, is that the records are nearly void. Historians agree that the Templars existed lodged by Baldwin I, their purpose supposedly the protection of pilgrims, yet between their founding and the Council of Troy in 1129, where they were formally recognised and granted a rule, there is almost nothing to track them by. No battles recorded under their name, no detailed charters, no famous relics paraded through the streets. They seem to vanish into stone corridors, living in obscurity. And that obscurity has acted like fertile soil in a deep forest, encouraging all manner of stories to sprout. One of the most persistent legends is that the knights spent those 9 years excavating beneath the Temple Mount. It is said that they tunnelled into chambers left from the days of Solomon, searching for the Ark of the Covenant, or at least for scrolls of lost wisdom. Medieval pilgrims spoke of seeing heaps of dirt move from hidden vaults at night, of hearing muffled sounds beneath the earth when the city slept. Later accounts even claim that passages wide enough for a mule cart were found, leading to speculation that the Templars had uncovered not only relics, but a system of subterranean storage. Yet here is the quirky twist. Among these tales, one odd detail recurs. A travelling merchant from Pisa wrote that he bought a curious item from a soldier who claimed it came out of the Temple Mount, a piece of wood, carved and polished smooth, said to be from the True Cross. But the merchant complained in his notes that the relic gave him nothing but splinters. Whether the wood was ancient cedar or just a leftover beam from a demolished roof is impossible to know, but the story captures the way relic trade and rumour mingled freely in that period. It was not uncommon for relics to multiply like mushrooms after rain, each one claiming authenticity, each one feeding the hungry imagination of believers and skeptics alike. Still, serious historians hesitate. There is no solid contemporary evidence of excavations, no charters describe it, no papal letters refer to it, and no trustworthy witness wrote of it at the time. Many scholars suggest the silence has a simpler explanation. The order was simply too small and too poor to leave much trace. Perhaps they were indeed escorting pilgrims, patching sandals, guarding lonely roads, their deeds too ordinary to earn a chronicler's ink. The drama of digging for treasure may have been a later invention, grafted onto a blank space in the record. Yet the debate remains unresolved. Some argue that even if they did not find relics, the years of silence were formative. It was in those years that they forged their internal culture, obedience, poverty, and secrecy. Living within the temple precinct, cut off from the bustle of the city, they developed habits of silence that would later define the order. In this view, the digging was not into soil but into spirit. They were germinating like seeds under the forest floor, unseen but preparing to break into daylight. The symbolism is striking. 9 men, hidden away in chambers that once echoed with caliph's prayers, now murmuring their own vows, shaping themselves into something neither monk nor knight but both. Bells tolled outside, marking hours, while inside the temple precinct, another rhythm took root. The discipline of obedience, the polish of armour done without vanity, the memorization of prayers spoken before dawn patrols. Steel was sharpened not for tournaments but for unseen duties. Mist drifted over the city, and within that mist a new form of brotherhood was taking shape. A debated detail that continues to puzzle scholars is why Baldwin the king, and Warmund, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, supported them so strongly despite their obscurity. If they were merely guarding pilgrims, why house them in the temple itself? Why allow them such prestige for so small a service? One theory is that the king saw them as a political experiment, a nucleus of disciplined fighters who owed loyalty not to feudal lords but directly to the crown and church. Another possibility is that the knights themselves had patrons in Europe, unseen hands funding them quietly until they could emerge fully. But again, hard proof is missing, leaving us in the fog of speculation. The silence of those years may also have been strategic. In an age when reputation was everything, perhaps they chose to remain unseen until their identity was fully forged. By the time they did emerge, they were ready to present not as a ragged band, but as a fully conceived order with a rule, a patron saint, and a powerful advocate in Bernard of Clairvaux. The obscurity becomes, in hindsight, part of the design, the way seeds must remain hidden underground until the time is right for a sapling to break the surface. And yet, we cannot quite banish the image of men with torches descending into the bowels of the temple, the scrape of shovels against stone, the whispered prayers echoing under arches built by forgotten hands. Even if untrue, the image clings like smoke because it answers a deep desire for mystery. To think that beneath the most sacred site on earth, men sworn to poverty unearthed something forbidden. It is the kind of story that will not let go, precisely because the silence of history leaves room for it to breathe. Whether digging into earth or into spirit, the 9 years were transformative. When they finally emerged into broader recognition at the Council of Troy in 1129, They were no longer an obscure band, but the beginning of a movement. It is as if the deep forest of silence nourished them, and when they stepped out, they were already rooted, already ready to spread across Christendom. And so, as the bells of Jerusalem tolled on, their sound muffled in the heavy air, a new chapter was waiting to open. The knights would leave behind the obscurity of mist and silence, and step into the light of councils, papal bulls, and theological champions. From hidden chambers, they would stride into history's stage. If this quiet journey feels right so far, you're welcome to tap like and drift on with us. The silence ends here, and the story now moves toward the man who would become their great voice and architect, the Cistercian abbot Bernard of Clairvaux. Out of mist, a figure steps, carrying not steel but words, ready to transform a handful of obscure knights into a recognised order of Christendom. By the time the Templars stepped into the wider stage of history, the voice that carried them forward did not come from a knight with sword in hand, but from a monk whose words rang louder than steel. Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian abbot born in Burgundy in 1090, was already regarded in his own lifetime as a spiritual giant, a man whose sermons could melt hearts and whose letters could sway kings. He was a mystic, but also a strategist, a contemplative monk who wielded words like weapons, hammering at councils and carving opinions as surely as a blacksmith strikes iron on an anvil. If the Templars had been seeds germinating in the dark silence of Jerusalem, Bernard was the gardener who brought them into the light. The historical fact is plain. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes in Champagne, Bernard threw the full weight of his reputation behind the Knights of the Temple. The council, convened under papal authority, gathered bishops, abbots, and secular lords to consider whether this strange new hybrid, part monk, part soldier, should be recognised. Bernard did not simply endorse them, he crafted the very theological framework that made them legitimate. His treatise, in praise of the new knighthood, painted them not as mercenaries or zealots, but as holy warriors who combined the purity of monks with the courage of knights. By linking their identity to both spiritual devotion and military discipline, Bernard effectively forged the brand of the Templars. Without him, their order might have remained a curiosity, a footnote. With him, they became an institution. Yet Bernard was not a man of compromise. His asceticism was legendary. He lived on so little food that his fellow monks feared for his health, and he often fell ill from exhaustion caused by fasting. One quirky anecdote tells of how, when served a meal that seemed too indulgent, a plate with a hint of spice or a dash of butter, he would quietly give it away to another monk without a word. Another story insists that Bernard once chastised a brother for admiring the carvings of grotesque creatures in a cloister, saying that monks should not let their eyes feast on stone monsters when their souls were hungry for God. Such details paint him as a man at once severe and deeply human, a man who carried the scent of forests on his cloak and the echo of bells in his prayers. But the debate around Bernard's role with the Templars is where the mist thickens. Was he their genuine advocate, moved by conviction that a new kind of knighthood was necessary for Christendom? Or was he also a savvy manipulator, recognising in them a tool to extend the influence of his Cistercian vision and his allies within the papacy? Historians disagree. Some see him as a true idealist, captivated by the idea that knights could shed the stains of worldly ambition by binding themselves to vows of poverty and obedience. Others argue that Bernard's endorsement was political, a way to shape the crusading movement in line with his theological ideals, tightening church control over what had often been an unruly and violent endeavour. What is undeniable is the effect. His words spread like wildfire. Copies of In Praise of the New Knighthood circulated widely, and nobles who might have scoffed at the idea of poor knights began to see them as exemplars. Wealthy patrons, stirred by Bernard's rhetoric, opened their purses. Gifts of land and money began to flow, small at first, then steadily, until the order had resources far beyond its humble beginnings. The bells of churches across Europe rang in their support, each toll echoing like an endorsement, each monastery offering grain, each lord donating parcels of soil. In praise of the new knighthood, Bernard drew a contrast that would become the heart of Templar identity. He condemned worldly knights who fought for glory, who glittered in gilded armour and strutted like peacocks, yet often died for nothing more than pride. Against them, he set the image of the Templar, plain-clothed, obedient, wielding steel not for vanity but for God. His language was sharp, almost scornful toward the old chivalry but tender toward the new. In this rhetorical move he gave the Templars a halo of moral superiority. They were not killers. They were defenders of pilgrims, guardians of sacred places, shepherds with swords. The image stuck. It is difficult to overstate how powerful Bernard's endorsement was in an age when spiritual authority meant everything. He was, after all, the man whose sermons would later call the Second Crusade into being, whose voice could summon thousands to march across continents. To have such a man as their champion was like having the sound of bells rolling over valleys, carrying their name from village to village, monastery to monastery, until it became a chorus across Christendom. Yet, as always, the story has shadows. Some contemporaries grumbled that Bernard was dressing up violence in holy robes, that he was sanctifying war in a way that blurred the boundaries between monk and soldier too dangerously. Was it truly possible to swing a sword in charity? Could steel ever serve both altar and battlefield? The questions did not vanish. They only deepened as the Templars grew in power. Still, to Bernard's admirers, his advocacy was visionary. He gave the Templars not only legitimacy but a story, and in the medieval world, story was as powerful as stone walls. The monks of Clairvaux, Bernard's abbey nestled in the quiet of the Burgundian countryside, rang their bells and whispered prayers, never imagining how far their abbot's words would travel. From deep forests in France to the deserts of Jerusalem, the Templars now had a framework that allowed them to claim their place in both heaven's narrative and earth's politics. Quirky as it sounds, Bernard's writing also introduced a kind of brand management before the term existed. He described the knights as riding into battle with serenity, as men who could be killed but never defeated in spirit. He made them sound not just holy, but unbreakable, a marketing pitch that turned them from a curious band of poor knights into the chosen guardians of Christendom. In one sense, he forged their legend even before they had done anything truly legendary. And so, the silence of the 9 early years gave way to proclamation. The bells of Troy tolled, and the Templars were no longer obscure figures tucked into a chamber by the Temple Mount. They were now an official order, a recognized brotherhood, a new kind of force. Out of the mist of obscurity they stepped into daylight, armoured not only in steel but also in words. Bernard's voice fades here, but its echo lingers. The stage is set for what comes next. The papal bulls that would enshrine their privileges, turning words into law and parchment into shields more enduring than plate armour. The story moves now from the abbot's quill to the Pope's seal, from the forest of rhetoric into the fortress of legal decree. The transformation of the Templars from a curious band of poor knights into a power recognised across Christendom was not secured by swords alone. It was ink and parchment, seals pressed into warm wax, and words whispered in papal chambers that gave them their shield. The clang of steel might echo across battlefields, but it was the soft scratch of quills on vellum that turned them into a legal entity, untouchable in ways no fortress could guarantee. In this age, bells did not ring only for mass. They rang to announce decrees, and in the 1130s and 1140s 3 papal bulls tolled like iron bells across Europe. Their sound carried farther than cavalry charges, and their echoes would last for centuries. The first of these, issued in the 1139, was Omni Datum Optimum by Pope Innocent II. It declared that the Knights of the Temple were answerable only to the Pope himself. They were freed from paying tithes to local bishops, excused from taxes, and granted the right to collect their own revenues. This was a radical shift. In a world where every monastery, every abbey, every estate was tangled in layers of feudal obligation, the Templars were now like a stone lifted out of the soil and set apart. They became an institution outside the normal chains of command, a kind of floating island, loyal only upward to Rome. 2 more followed, In 1144, Pope Celestine II issued Milites Templi, extending the privileges further and calling upon all the faithful to support the Templars with donations. Then, in 1145, Pope Eugene III signed Militia Dei, which permitted the order to collect burial fees and tithes directly, bypassing local clergy. With these three bulls, the Templars were cocooned in a shimmering bubble of legality, untouchable by ordinary bishops, exempt from ordinary dues, immune to the grasp of secular rulers. They became, in essence, a state within a state, invisible to local authority but present everywhere. The quirky detail, almost comic if it weren't so telling, is that when these privileges first spread across Europe, some parish priests grew desperate. Imagine a small village church in Burgundy or Lombardy, its roof leaking, its parishioners poor. A priest hears that the new Templar house down the road can collect tithes directly, and the faithful are encouraged to donate to them instead. There are stories of priests grumbling aloud that they were competing with monks who rode war horses. One complaint preserved in a local chronicle snidely observed that the poor knights who claim no riches now fill their barns while ours stand empty. In some towns, bells tolled for mass in parish churches to empty pews, while across the street the sound of coin clinking into Templar chests echoed more loudly. But debate clings tightly to these bulls. Were they granted purely out of admiration for the Templars' mission, or were they also political manoeuvres in a tense papal landscape? Pope Innocent II, who issued Omni Datum Optimum, had just survived a schism that threatened his papacy. Some historians argue that empowering the Templars was not only about supporting pilgrims, but also about creating a loyal, independent force that could bypass unreliable bishops and princes. Others suggest that Bernard of Clairvaux's influence was decisive, that the Pope trusted Bernard so fully that any cause he championed received automatic papal favour. Still others caution that the bulls should not be overinterpreted. They were privileges, yes, but privileges in a world where papal favours were scattered like seeds and not all sprouted equally. Yet the impact cannot be denied. With papal seals in hand, the Templars could enter a town, buy land, build a chapel, and ignore the local bishop's protests. Their coffers filled with donations, sometimes in coin, sometimes in grain, sometimes in sheep. A widow in Toulouse could leave a vineyard to them in her will, bypassing both her family and her parish. A merchant in Pisa could deposit funds with them, confident that papal protection made those funds safer than any bank chest. The order became wrapped in law, as though parchment itself had become armour. One can almost picture it. Knights who once claimed poverty now standing in chapels where the bells rang for them, opening letters with dangling red seals, reading words that elevated them beyond king's interference. Steel was still at their sides, but it was paper that protected them. Paper did not rust. Paper did not dull. Paper was silent but enduring. And in the quiet corridors of their commanderies, the scratch of quills became as important as the clang of swords. Quirks of these privileges multiplied. In England, for example, the Templars were so exempt from local laws that they could run their own markets free of royal tolls. In one case, they even fined travellers who used their bridges, pocketing the fee with papal sanction. This raised eyebrows among locals who wondered why men sworn to poverty collected tolls like tavern keepers. But when challenged, the Templars could simply point to Rome. The parchment was their shield. Still, suspicion brewed. Parish priests saw their flocks drained. Secular rulers bristled at men who answered to no one but the distant Pope. In France, neighbours grumbled that the Templars built stone barns larger than some manors. In Italy, their chapels gleamed while parish churches crumbled. In Germany, their estates multiplied, and some bishops muttered that they were like ivy, climbing over the walls of the church itself. Debate swirled. Had the Pope given too much? Was the order swelling beyond its rightful place? And yet, to pilgrims and kings alike, the bulls were reassurance. They meant that donations were safe, that knights could travel freely, that Templar lands were protected. The mist of uncertainty around their origins was being burned away by the bright flame of papal legitimacy. The order now stood not just as a group of knights, but as a legal framework spanning continents. The deep forest of medieval politics had many shadows, but in this forest the Templars walked with papal torches. The three bulls together formed what might be called their paper fortress. Unlike stone castles, which could crumble under siege, or steel, which could bend in battle, these parchments created an invisible wall that stretched across kingdoms. Wherever they went, the echo of papal bells followed them. Local lords might rattle their chains of authority, but the Templars carried a louder chain, links of ink and wax binding them to the Pope alone. By the middle of the 12th century, this paper fortress had already begun to change their identity. They were no longer just knights guarding pilgrims on dusty roads. They were administrators, collectors, landholders, diplomats. They were wealthy in ways that their vow of poverty could never disguise. And while some mocked their seal of 2 men on 1 horse as a farce, the truth was that their horses were now many, their estates broad, their coffers deep. The paradox of poverty and wealth, humility and power was baked into their very image. The story now moves forward, from parchment shields to the strange branding that would make their paradox even more powerful. The motif of 2 knights on 1 horse became their emblem, a claim to poverty that drew more gold than boasting ever could. From bells tolling papal approval, we shift to seals stamped with that curious image, an early logo in a world that was just learning the art of branding. In the world of medieval Europe, symbols mattered as much as swords. A banner unfurled on the battlefield could rally men to courage or send them scattering in fear. A coat of arms carved into stone could proclaim lineage for centuries. For the Knights of the Temple, their symbol was at once humble and audacious, 2 armoured knights riding a single horse. It was a seal that seemed almost comical, yet behind its odd simplicity lay a paradox that became their most powerful brand. The historical fact is that this image appears on their official seal by the mid-12th century. Wax impressions survive, showing the stark design. 1 horse, 2 men in armour, pressed in lines so plain that even the illiterate could recognise it. To the medieval mind, the seal was a guarantee of authenticity, a signature before signatures, a stamp that made documents valid. For the Templars, it became their calling card, pressed into charters, letters, and receipts across Christendom. Whenever a parcel of land was transferred to them, whenever money was deposited, whenever an agreement was signed, the strange emblem of shared poverty sealed it. At first glance, the image seems to say, "We are poor." 2 men on 1 horse meant that they lacked the resources to equip each knight with his own mount. It echoed the legend of their beginnings, when 9 men supposedly shared what little they had. The vow of poverty was encoded in the very wax, a constant reminder that these knights were not like others. They did not strut in gilded armour or compete in tournaments for fame. They lived with austerity, and yet, here comes the paradox. By the time this seal was in common use, the order was anything but poor. Their coffers were swelling, their estates multiplying, their privileges stacking higher than any monasteries. The emblem of poverty had become the golden key that unlocked wealth. The quirky detail is how people reacted to the seal. In one story, a merchant in Provence received a Templar receipt bearing the emblem and laughed, saying he trusted them precisely because they mocked themselves. He compared it to a tavern sign shaped like a cracked jug, a joke that turned into a promise. In another tale, a village boy who saw the seal for the first time asked his father if the knights were jesters, since only fools ride 2 to a horse. The father, wary of blasphemy, hushed him at once, reminding him that these were men under papal protection. The image, strange as it was, stuck in people's minds, both comical and profound, a reminder that humility itself could be a weapon. But debate surrounds the emblem's true meaning. Was it merely literal, a nod to their supposed poverty, or did it hold deeper allegory? Some scholars argue that the 2 riders symbolised fraternity, the brotherhood of knights who shared everything, even their steeds. Others see it as a mystical image, the union of the active life and the contemplative life, 2 riders moving as one, knight and monk inseparable. Still others suggest it was a kind of quiet rebuke to worldly knights, an image saying, "While you parade with squires and servants, we share one horse and yet achieve more." The mist of interpretation lingers, and perhaps the ambiguity was intentional. In a world of symbols, meaning was often layered, meant to provoke thought as much as to declare identity. The emblem also served practical purposes. In an age when literacy was rare, the design made their documents unmistakable. Anyone could recognise the oddity of two men squeezed onto one steed. It became their logo centuries before the word existed, a piece of visual branding that carried across borders. A bishop in Spain, a merchant in England, a prince in Hungary. Each, when presented with a Templar charter, would see the seal and know instantly who it belonged to. Bells tolled in abbeys when charters were read aloud, and alongside the ringing words came the display of the seal, the tiny circle of wax bearing two riders. The sound of bells and the sight of that emblem together reinforced their authority. The contradiction between image and reality grew sharper as the order expanded. The poor knights now owned castles, vineyards, mills, and entire villages. They collected tithes, ran farms, and operated what amounted to banks. Yet they continued to press into wax the image of poverty. Some contemporaries noticed the irony. A satirical song from the 13th century joked that 2 riders on 1 horse was a lie, since the Templars by then had stables fuller than many kings. But satire did little to dent their image. If anything, the emblem's persistence demonstrated the order's mastery of narrative. They controlled not only lands and money, but also the story told about themselves. In the deep forest of medieval memory, the emblem became almost mythical. To peasants, it suggested that even powerful knights could be humble, living like monks. To nobles, it reminded them that this order was different, not to be confused with greedy mercenaries. To clerics, it signalled obedience to the vow of poverty, no matter how many estates lay behind monastery walls. The seal condensed their paradox into a single picture, a picture that could travel farther and faster than any sermon. Quirky offshoots of the emblem appeared as well. Some commanderies carved it into stone doorways, though often with awkward proportions. Horses too small, knights too large, making the image look like children riding a mule. Pilgrims sometimes scratched crude versions into the margins of their journals, the medieval equivalent of doodling a logo. One monk even claimed to see in a dream the 2 riders transformed into angels sharing wings, riding not a horse but a beast of light. Such visions, whether real or imagined, added to the mystique. The debated question that lingers is whether the emblem fooled people or enlightened them. Did donors truly believe the Templars were still poor? Or did they knowingly play along, understanding that poverty was more spiritual posture than economic reality? Some historians think that everyone understood the irony and accepted it, because the Templars offered something more important than honesty. They offered security and legitimacy. Others argue that peasants and minor nobles were indeed deceived, imagining their gifts went to struggling monks rather than a wealthy institution. The answer is elusive, wrapped in the mist of medieval perception. What is certain is that the emblem worked. It drew donations, secured loyalty, and made the Templars memorable. In a world without printing presses or mass media, they managed to brand themselves in a way that endured for generations. The clang of steel in battle was impressive, but the quiet imprint of 2 riders on wax was in many ways more lasting. Paper burned, castles fell, but seals survived, pressed into parchment that endured centuries, and so the Templars entered the mid-12th century carrying an identity as paradoxical as it was powerful. They were wealthy yet called poor, humble yet feared, plain in appearance yet grand in influence. Their emblem crystallised that paradox into an unforgettable image. 2 knights, 1 horse, the story of poverty masking power, of humility feeding wealth, of a brand that no rival could match. From here, the tale shifts again. The emblem was more than a picture. It was a door through which donations and privileges poured. With the papal bulls protecting them and the seal branding them, the Templars moved naturally into a new role. They were becoming not only knights and monks, but bankers of Europe, custodians of treasure, managers of royal debts. The bells of churches had endorsed them, the seals of wax had certified them. Now, the chests of silver would begin to flow. If this gentle pace suits your night, you may subscribe to Serene myths and return whenever the bells call. The story drifts onward, from symbols pressed in wax to numbers written in ledgers. From the paradox of poverty, we now enter the paradox of wealth. Section 7 will open these coffers and show how the Templars, who claimed to own little, came to hold more coin than kings, building a network of finance that stretched across the continent like roots in a hidden forest. By the middle of the 12th century, the Knights of the Temple had grown far beyond their image of two riders sharing a single horse. The emblem still travelled with them, pressed in wax, but behind the seal stood something far more formidable than shared poverty. A financial system that stretched across Europe and the Levant. They were knights, yes, but they were also bankers. Bankers without a crown, without a throne, yet wielding power that even kings envied. The historical fact is that by the 1150s, the Templars had established a network of commanderies across Europe, houses in France, England, Spain, Italy and beyond, that functioned as both monasteries and administrative hubs. These commanderies collected rents, donations and tithes, and the funds were not merely stored but moved, transferred and recorded. A pilgrim in Paris could deposit money with the Templars and then travel to Acre or Jerusalem, where a corresponding sum would be available, less a fee. In essence, the Templars created a system of credit letters, a medieval version of cheques or travellers' notes. This spared pilgrims the danger of carrying coin through bandit-ridden roads, and it spared merchants the risk of robbery on sea voyages. The quirky detail that often surprises modern listeners is the way fees were structured. The Templars were forbidden by canon law from charging interest. Usury was a sin, but they found creative ways around it. Instead of interest, they levied administrative fees, sometimes in the form of a percentage of the deposit, other times disguised as currency exchange costs. There's even a record of a merchant complaining that the Templars charged him a fee for counting his coins, a service he thought unnecessary, but had no choice but to accept. The knights may have worn plain habits and spoken vows of poverty, but when it came to ledgers, they were as meticulous and inventive as any modern banker. Yet debate swirls around the scale of this financial empire. Some historians argue that it has been exaggerated, that the Templars were indeed important financiers but not a Bank of Europe in the sense of modern central banks. Others point out that kings and nobles repeatedly entrusted their treasuries to the order. By the late 12th century, the French crown kept funds with the Templars in Paris, and the English crown occasionally used Templar houses as vaults. One debated case concerns King Henry II of England, who may have used Templar accounts to channel funds for his campaigns in France. The records are murky, as medieval bookkeeping was hardly transparent, but the very suspicion reveals how embedded the knights had become in royal finance. Imagine the scene in Paris where the Templars' main house stood on the right bank of the Seine. Behind thick stone walls, bells tolled for prayers, reminding the knights of their vows, while in nearby rooms clerks bent over parchments, scratching figures into columns. Chests of coin clinked as they were opened, weighed, and resealed. Steel swords leaned against walls, but the true power lay in quills and wax seals. A nobleman might stride in with a pouch of silver, leave with a receipt marked by the emblem of two riders, and walk out reassured that his funds were safer here than in his own manor. The mist of secrecy surrounded these operations. Few outside the order knew exactly how their finances were managed, and this opacity both protected them and provoked suspicion. To common folk, the knights were an enigma. Monks who handled money, soldiers who kept ledgers, poor men who built barns larger than manor houses. Some whispered that they must be alchemists, turning donations into endless wealth, or that they had discovered treasures under the Temple Mount and used them as seed capital. Others believed their prosperity was simply divine favour, proof that God rewarded their service. Quirks of their financial practices extended to unexpected corners. In some towns, they ran mills that ground grain at slightly lower fees than competitors, undercutting local lords and drawing business their way. In London, the Templars managed a wharf, collecting tolls from merchants who docked there. In Portugal, They held vineyards whose wines were sold not only to pilgrims, but also exported across seas. The order's brand of poverty became almost ironic. Every coin earned was justified as for the mission, even as their coffers deepened. The debated question is whether the Templars invented banking as we know it, or simply perfected existing practices. Italian merchants in Amalfi and Venice already used letters of credit, and Jewish financiers across Europe were experienced in lending despite restrictions. The Templars, however, had two advantages that others lacked: papal protection and an international network of houses united under a single rule. Their letters of credit could be trusted because the order was trusted, their receipts honoured because their seal was known from Jerusalem to Paris. It was not invention so much as institutionalization, turning scattered practices into a system that kings themselves relied upon. What made this system extraordinary was its reach. A pilgrim carrying a parchment marked with the two-rider emblem could cross kingdoms with confidence, knowing that from Burgundy to Acre the same network awaited. In a world where local lords often mistrusted one another, the Templars created a thread of continuity, a bridge of trust. Their steel kept roads safe, their bells rang for prayer, their parchment bore promises. In the deep forest of medieval uncertainty, they offered a clear path, and yet envy shadowed them. Kings who deposited funds sometimes found themselves beholden to the order, unable to access money without their cooperation. Princes who borrowed discovered the Templars could act as creditors with papal backing, untouchable by threats of seizure. Ordinary priests resented how donations flowed into Templar coffers rather than parish chests. Their paper shield, granted by papal bulls, made them immune to local law, and their growing wealth made them targets of suspicion. The paradox grew louder. The order still presented itself as humble, still pressed seals showing poverty, still rang bells for prayers in simple chapels. But in the heart of Paris their treasuries clinked with coin enough to rival crowns. The clang of steel was quieter now than the shuffle of clerks and the rustle of parchment. Power had shifted from battlefield to ledger, from sword to seal. One could say that the Templars learned the true nature of power in the 12th century. Not just the power to defend pilgrims with swords, but the power to move wealth with pen strokes. They became indispensable, and in becoming indispensable they became both admired and feared. As night falls in this part of the story, picture the Templar house in Paris again. Bells echo across the Seine, mist rises from the river, and inside the fortress, steel glimmers faintly on racks while clerks tally coin by candlelight. A king sleeps uneasy, knowing his treasury rests in their hands. And the paradox, pressed in wax and written in ledgers, grows deeper. From here, the story shifts from the chests of coin to the stones of castles. The Templars' financial might was not hoarded, it was built into fortresses, into commanderies that dotted Europe and the Levant. Section 8 will open those gates, showing how wealth became walls, how steel and stone fused into a network of power, spread across trade routes and battlefronts alike. If the Templars' parchments and ledgers made them bankers without a crown, it was their castles that made them masters of terrain. Money could move on paper, but it needed safe passage across mountains, rivers, deserts and coasts. To guarantee that movement, the order raised fortresses, massive walls of stone, towers bristling with steel, and gates heavy enough to withstand the pounding of rams. More than military outposts, these fortresses were nodes in a network, high points of command through which flowed not only soldiers but also pilgrims, caravans, goods and gold. The historical fact is clear. By the mid-12th century, the Templars maintained dozens of fortresses across the Holy Land and Europe. Some of the most famous, like Safed in Galilee, Tortosa on the Syrian coast, and Chateau Pellerin near Atli, stood as bulwarks against hostile forces. These fortresses were not improvised. They were carefully designed, with concentric walls, moats, and towers placed for overlapping fields of fire. At Chateau Pellerin, built in 1218, the walls rose sheer from the Mediterranean, so formidable that Muslim chroniclers called it the Invincible Fortress. To pilgrims arriving by sea, the sight must have been staggering. Bells ringing from a chapel perched on a cliff, banners snapping in the salt wind, and behind the walls, knights moving with silent discipline. Yet within these mighty walls lay more than soldiers. Fortresses served as depots where grain, oil, wine and coin were stored. They were way stations for pilgrims, offering protection, food and medical care. They were hubs where merchants paid fees, caravans were taxed, and letters of credit were honoured. In effect, the fortresses were not merely castles. They were customs houses, treasuries, hospitals and monasteries all in one. The clang of steel mingled with the rustle of parchment, the murmur of prayers and the jingle of coin. The quirky detail is that records from a few of these castles preserve the most mundane inventories, reminders that even in stone fortresses, daily life was filled with ordinary needs. At Safed, one account lists the purchase of peppercorns, saffron and even ginger, delicacies that travelled along spice routes. At another fortress, the kitchen tallies included thousands of loaves of bread baked for garrisons, alongside barrels of salted fish. One list even included candles made of honey wax so large they had to be trimmed with knives as they burned. These details reveal that the fortresses were not only bastions of defence but also centres of consumption. Kitchens bustling, storerooms fragrant with spices, chapels glowing with candlelight. Yet debate swirls about their true purpose. Were the fortresses primarily defensive, protecting the Latin kingdom against enemies, or were they more about control? Choke points that allowed the Templars to dominate trade routes and pilgrim paths. Some historians argue that the castles were never meant to win wars outright. Rather, they served as watchtowers of power, making the Templars indispensable. A caravan of merchants carrying silk from Damascus could be taxed if it passed a Templar fortress. A group of pilgrims could be sheltered and fed, their donations collected. Others counter that these castles were first and foremost defensive strongholds, crucial to delaying Muslim armies long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The truth, as so often, lies in the miss-between. Imagine approaching such a fortress at dusk. The path winds upward, torches flicker along the walls, and the sound of bells drifts downward from a chapel tower. The air is thick with the scent of animals, horses, donkeys, camels, mingling with the sharper tang of iron. Mist sometimes clung to the stones in the early morning, giving the walls an almost spectral presence. To a pilgrim, exhausted and fearful of raids, the sight must have been like entering a sanctuary in the wilderness, a deep forest of stone that promised safety. But these fortresses also cast long shadows. Local lords often resented the Order's ability to bypass their authority. A count who once collected tolls along a river might find that the Templars had built a commandery nearby, diverting traffic and revenue. In some regions, their castles became economic competitors, offering mills or markets free from the usual taxes. The immunity granted by papal bulls made them untouchable, and so their fortresses symbolised not only protection, but also privilege. The debate extends even further. Were these fortresses too costly? Some chroniclers, even within Christendom, complained that vast sums of money were poured into building and maintaining stone walls that often fell when armies too large appeared. After all, even Chateau Pellerin, deemed invincible, was eventually abandoned in 1291 when Acre fell. Critics argued that the Templars' obsession with fortifications tied up resources that might have been better spent on mobile armies or diplomacy. Admirers, however, insisted that without these castles, the fragile Christian presence in the Holy Land would have collapsed decades earlier. One cannot ignore the symbolic resonance. Each fortress was a statement. Here stands the Temple's order, immovable, disciplined, and sanctioned by Rome. The clang of hammers on stone echoed like a vow, the rising walls like psalms built in limestone. Within those walls, monks prayed, knights sharpened swords, scribes tallied accounts, and peasants tilled surrounding fields. It was a whole society in miniature, sustained by faith and finance. The quirky human side still peeked through. Letters mention that at Tortosa, one knight kept a pet falcon, and at Safed, a garrison amused itself by holding races between mules, At one commandery in France, a traveller complained that the soup was so bland he wondered if the vow of poverty extended to seasoning. These small glimpses remind us that behind the grandeur of fortresses lived ordinary men with tastes, jokes and complaints, but the grandeur could not be denied. Pilgrims wrote in awe of fortress chapels lit by hundreds of candles, of banners rippling against starry skies, of the solemn silence when knights gathered for prayer, steel armour glinting in lamplight. These were not castles like any other. They were sanctuaries fused with strongholds, monasteries fused with barracks. In them, the paradox of the Templars reached full expression. The marriage of monk and knight, of steel and prayer, of commerce and devotion. As Europe and the Levant leaned on these fortresses, the Templars themselves leaned ever more deeply into their dual role. Their castles were arteries through which flowed grain and gold, yet they were also lungs breathing out the aura of holiness and protection. The bells that rang from their towers carried not only prayers, but also the weight of authority, announcing that here stood an order above kings and princes. And yet, just as fortresses projected strength, they also drew envy. Their walls whispered of independence, their towers of arrogance, their exemptions of immunity too broad to last unchallenged. In their stone, as much as in their paper, the seeds of suspicion were sown. Night settles on the fortress now. Mist coils around the ramparts, steel rests in racks, and the deep forest of power stretches outward into valleys below. Tomorrow, caravans will arrive, pilgrims will seek shelter, clerks will tally fees. The fortress will continue to stand as a high point of command, a beacon in a turbulent land. But the story does not pause here. Beyond the walls lies another order, one that looked so much like the Templars and yet not, the Knights Hospitaller. Were they rivals or partners, opponents or counterparts in a shared play? Section 9 will step into their shadow, exploring how these two orders mirrored and complemented each other, like twin riders on the same horse of history. The clang of steel was never far in the medieval Holy Land, and yet the clang did not always come from enemies. Sometimes it rang between neighbours who wore the same crosses, prayed the same prayers, and claimed the same vows. To understand the Templars, one must place them alongside their counterpart, the Knights Hospitaller. The two orders, born from the same soil of crusade and faith, grew side by side like twin trees in the deep forest of Christendom. From a distance they seemed rivals, each competing for land, donations and prestige. But up close, the lines blur, and what appears as opposition can look more like two hands of the same body. The firm historical fact is that the Hospitallers predated the Templars. Originating as a brotherhood running a hospital for pilgrims in Jerusalem, hence their name, they had already been granted papal approval by the early 12th century. When the Templars emerged around 1119, they stepped into a landscape where the Hospitallers were already respected. The Hospitallers wore black cloaks with white crosses, a visual contrast to the Templars' white mantles with red crosses. They cared for the sick, ran hospices, and escorted pilgrims, but by mid-century they too had become militarised. Hospitaller fortresses like Crac des Chevaliers became as renowned as Templar strongholds. Both orders fielded knights, both collected donations across Europe, and both answered directly to the Pope. The quirky detail lies in how closely their roles sometimes overlapped in daily life. A traveller's account from the 1170s describes arriving in Acre and being confused by the two orders' houses standing only streets apart. The Hospitallers offered him broth and a bed, while the Templars checked his letters of credit. It was as if, he wrote, I had lodged in a monastery and a bank on the same road, both guarded by men with swords. In another curious note, pilgrims joked that Hospitallers smelled of herbs and ointments from tending the sick, while Templars smelled of horse sweat and iron. This mingling of charity and steel became part of the folklore that grew around the two orders. Yet here the mist of debate rises. Were the Templars and Hospitallers truly rivals locked in competition, or were they partners playing different roles in the same larger drama? On the one hand, their records show occasional disputes over land, privileges and precedence. Bishops sometimes complained that donations meant for the poor were siphoned by both, each claiming superior rights. Kings occasionally tried to play them off against each other, granting favours to one to pressure the other. In 1258, for instance, a dispute in Acre between the two orders grew so heated that they reportedly fought a pitched battle in the streets, with casualties on both sides. That incident, preserved in chronicles, suggests rivalry could indeed boil into violence. On the other hand, many scholars argue that such disputes were exceptions rather than the rule. In practice, the two orders often divided responsibilities. Hospitallers focused more on hospitals, pilgrim care, and certain fortresses, while Templars leaned toward banking, administration, and frontline castles. Their overlap was real, but not always antagonistic. Some liken them to two wings of the same bird, both necessary for flight. When major battles loomed, the two orders fought side by side, their banners rising in parallel, their bells ringing in unison before charges. Muslim chroniclers often lump them together as the red-crossed monks, not distinguishing between black mantles and white. The deep forest of interpretation offers yet another view, that rivalry itself was part of a performance. By presenting themselves as distinct, they avoided accusations of monopoly, while in practice they reinforced each other's dominance. When donors in Europe tired of giving to one, they might turn to the other, but either way, wealth stayed within the circle of militarized monasticism. The balance of rivalry and cooperation created a closed loop of power, where two hands sometimes wrestled, yet ultimately worked together. Quirks of perception abound in chronicles. One tale insists that Hospitallers once carried sick pilgrims on litters, even into battle camps, ministering amid arrows, while Templars stood guard with lances lowered. Another anecdote describes how a Hospitaller commander scolded a Templar for hoarding grain during a famine, only to borrow that same grain weeks later when his own supplies ran dry. Such stories, part truth and part exaggeration, highlight the paradoxical intimacy of their relationship, so close that conflict and cooperation were never far apart. The debated point most intriguing is whether the papacy itself encouraged this duality. Some historians argue that Rome favoured having two great orders rather than one, ensuring no single group could dominate unchecked. The Templars and Hospitallers in this reading were deliberate counterweights, each strong enough to prevent the other from slipping beyond papal control. Others dismiss this as overthinking, suggesting the papacy simply blessed what emerged naturally. Still, the suspicion that rivalry was engineered lingers in the background, like bells tolling faintly through fog. From the perspective of the pilgrim, however, such politics mattered little. To the weary traveller trudging dusty roads, it was enough that Hospitallers offered food and balm while Templars offered steel and escort. The sight of both banners along a route was reassurance, the cross of care and the cross of defence. The pilgrim might not have cared if the two fraternities argued in council chambers. He cared that robbers fled at the sight of their patrols, that hospitals took him in when fever struck, that both orders together made the Holy Land navigable. Still, suspicion brewed among secular rulers. Kings eyed both orders warily, recognising that together they held vast lands, treasuries and fortresses. Some nobles mocked them as lords without ladies, bachelor barons whose estates multiplied without heirs. The steel of their swords was formidable, but the steel of their legal privileges, immunity, papal backing, financial power, was perhaps even sharper. Whether acting as rivals or as quiet partners, the two orders together created a monopoly of holiness and war unlike anything else in Europe. Night falls now over Acre, where Hospitaller and Templar houses once stood almost side by side. Bells toll from both chapels, the sound blending into a single chorus. Mist drifts through the harbour, blurring banners on the wind. To an outsider, the two fraternities might seem indistinguishable, two faces of the same coin. Yet to insiders, their identities mattered, their rivalries mattered, their complementarity mattered. If you're listening now, you can leave a small sign, like or subscribe, and tell us where in time you've joined. The story now turns inward, back to the Templars themselves. Rivalries aside, their strength lay in discipline, in the silence of their rule, in the absolute authority of their Grand Master. If their partnership with the Hospitallers showed one form of duality, their own inner structure showed another. Unity so tight it functioned like a single brain, a body of men moving at the command of one voice. Section 10 will step into this chamber of silence, where bells mark hours, steel stands at attention, and the weight of obedience forges the Templars into an organism unlike any other in medieval Europe. If the Templars' fortresses were their walls and their banking was their bloodstream, then their rule, their law and discipline, was their nervous system. At the centre of it all stood the Grand Master, the singular mind through which every decision pulsed. To understand why the Templars could move like a single organism, whether marching into battle or negotiating a royal treasury, one must step inside the architecture of their rule, where silence was not emptiness but control, and obedience was not weakness but strength. The firm historical fact is that the Templars followed a detailed rule, first formalised at the Council of Troyes in 1129 and expanded over the following decades. Inspired partly by the Cistercian model of monastic life, it set out everything from how knights should dress to how they should pray, eat, and fight. White mantles were mandated for knights, signifying purity, while brothers of lower rank wore black or brown. Meals were taken in common, often in silence, with readings from scripture. Poverty was enforced through collective ownership. No knight could hold personal wealth. Even their beards were regulated, for shaving was discouraged. This meticulous rule book created uniformity across an order that spanned continents. The quirky detail is the way punishments were handled. Unlike secular armies where misbehaviour might bring flogging or fines, the Templars punished lapses with fasting. A knight who broke discipline might be given only bread and water for days or weeks, depending on the severity. For more serious offences, such as disobedience in battle, a knight could be expelled from the order altogether, his white mantle stripped away in a ritual of humiliation. Chronicles even mention the odd case of a brother being punished for speaking out of turn at table, sentenced to eat on the floor like a dog. These penalties, harsh yet symbolic, reinforced the sense that membership was not a right but a fragile gift, maintained only through absolute obedience. Debate remains about the extent of the Grand Master's power within this structure. Was he truly an autocrat, commanding without restraint, or was he bound by the chapter of senior knights? The sources paint a mixed picture. On the one hand, the Grand Master's authority was supreme in matters of war and governance. When he spoke, knights obeyed without hesitation. On the other hand, the chapter could overrule or advise, and major decisions, such as treaties, alliances, or abandoning fortresses, often required broader consent. Some historians describe the order as a monarchy tempered by council, while others see it as closer to a military dictatorship in monk's clothing. The mist of medieval records makes certainty elusive, but the perception of near-total obedience endures. Picture a Templar chapter meeting. The knights gather in a stone hall, seated in rows along the walls, white mantles lined like bark along the trunks of a deep forest. Bells toll to mark the beginning. Silence reigns as the Grand Master enters, his presence a living symbol of authority. When a decision is to be made, brothers may offer counsel, but when the Master speaks, it is final. The clang of steel outside the hall, squires sharpening swords, blacksmiths hammering, reminds everyone that obedience is not theoretical. It is what keeps them alive when lances lower and arrows fly. The strength of this system was evident on the battlefield. Chronicles describe how Templar units charged as a block, never breaking formation, even when others fled. At the disastrous Battle of Hattin in 1187, the Templars fought to the last, forming a desperate shield wall around the True Cross relic. Their discipline made them both admired and feared, for unlike feudal knights who often fought for personal glory or loot, the Templars fought as one body under one command. It was not courage alone, it was law internalized, obedience turned into instinct. Yet this discipline had its costs. Quirky anecdotes reveal how stifling the silence could be. A Templar guest at a meal once remarked that the dining hall felt like a graveyard with spoons. Another chronicler noted that brothers were forbidden even to stroke a hunting dog lest it distract them from prayer. Some new recruits, accustomed to the boisterous life of secular knighthood, found the quiet unbearable and left within months. The order's survival depended on men who could live with such strictness, who could let bells dictate their hours and accept that their lives were not their own, but the property of the temple. The debated point here is whether such discipline bred virtue or oppression. Admirers saw it as the very secret of the Templars' strength. Selfless warriors unshackled from pride, united in purpose, immune to corruption. Critics, even in the Middle Ages, argued that such silence and obedience created blind men, unthinking tools in the hands of their superiors. Could knights sworn never to question commands slide into cruelty without conscience? The accusation would echo centuries later when their secrecy and obedience became fodder for charges of heresy and corruption. Still, in their prime, the structure worked. Across thousands of miles from castles in Syria to farms in England, Templar houses ran with the same rhythms, the same prayers, the same fasts, the same rules. The Grand Master in Jerusalem or Paris could rely on obedience stretching like an unbroken chain through the Order's vast domains. Bells rang in commanderies across Christendom, each toll a link in that chain, each brother part of a single organism whose head was the Master. And yet, like any chain, its strength depended on both unity and flexibility. There were moments when rigidity broke them, when strict orders led them into traps, when refusal to retreat brought annihilation. The Battle of Hattin was one such moment, their discipline turning into doom. Still, the legend of their obedience endured, becoming both their strength and their vulnerability. As night settles on this vision of the Order, imagine a Templar dormitory. Rows of beds aligned with military precision, armour hung neatly, swords resting at reach. The only sound is the slow breathing of men and the faint toll of a bell marking midnight prayers. Discipline has seeped into every pore, into every dream. The Grand Master does not need to shout. His authority is in the very silence, the very rhythm of bells through stone halls. The story moves now from the inner chamber of law to the outer halls of power. For even the most disciplined order could not escape the reach of kings, and one king in particular, Philip V of France, would test the strength of their obedience and the limits of their shield. Section 11 will bring him into the mist, a monarch in debt, a realm in need, and a plan to cut the chain that bound him to the temple. The clang of steel had carried the Templars across continents, but by the dawn of the 14th century, it was the rustle of parchment and the clink of coin that drew them into their greatest peril. For while their rule demanded obedience and their fortresses commanded awe, they were not beyond the reach of kings, and among kings none was more calculating, more relentless than Philip IV of France. Known as Philip the Fair, he was admired for his regal bearing, yet feared for his cold ambition. He was a monarch tangled in debts, and to him the wealth of the Templars gleamed like a chain he longed to cut. The historical fact is unambiguous. Philip IV owed large sums to the Templars. Wars against England, conflicts with Flanders, and the expensive machinery of his court had drained the royal treasury. Like other rulers, Philip had turned to the Templars for loans and for the safekeeping of funds. Their Paris house served almost like a royal bank, storing the crown's wealth and extending credit. But by the first decade of the 14th century, Philip's debts had grown so heavy that repayment seemed impossible. His reliance on the order made him uneasy. To a king accustomed to absolute authority, dependence was intolerable. Here enters the quirky detail. Chroniclers whisper that Philip once sent agents to audit the Templar treasury in Paris. When clerks dutifully produced ledgers, heavy with wax seals, Philip demanded to see the vault itself. He was led down into chambers where iron-bound chests stood stacked like tree trunks in a deep forest. The king, it is said, tapped one chest with his staff and asked, half in jest and half in irritation, "Does the temple guard better my coin than I do?" The irony is sharp. The very men sworn to poverty safeguarded more gold than their king. Whether the story is literal or embellished, it captures the humiliation of a monarch forced to lean on monk knights for his finances. The debated point is Philip's true motive in moving against the Templars. Was it sheer greed, a desperate grasp for their wealth to erase his debts? Or was it a more complex calculation, political, spiritual and personal all at once? Some historians argue that the charges of heresy later levelled against the Templars were a convenient mask, a pretext to seize their assets and break their independence. Others suggest Philip genuinely feared their power. An order answerable only to the Pope, with vast estates in France, could seem a rival authority, a state within his state. Still others speculate that Philip was also moved by personal enmity, nursing grudges from earlier clashes with clerical authority, seeing in the Templars another obstacle to royal supremacy. Whatever his motive, the air grew heavy with suspicion, like mist rolling into a valley. Rumours began to circulate that the Templars performed secret rites, that they spat on the cross in initiation, that they worshipped strange idols in hidden chambers. These whispers did not come from nowhere. They were seeded, nurtured, spread by agents loyal to the crown. Bells tolled in churches across France, but beneath their sound ran a darker undertone, the murmur of accusation. To the common people, the image of humble knights had long since cracked. They saw castles, estates and granaries fat with grain. They saw knights exempt from taxes while peasants toiled. They heard that kings themselves bowed to the temple's financial power. It was not difficult to believe when rumour whispered that arrogance might have turned into heresy. Philip's strategy relied on this readiness to believe. And yet the paradox deepened. The Templars still lived under their strict rule, meals in silence, fasts for disobedience, hours marked by prayer bells. These practices continued as they had for 2 centuries. A visitor to their Paris house in 1305 would still have found men in plain mantles, steel polished but unadorned, voices low, obedience strict. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but perception had shifted, and perception, once poisoned, spreads like roots beneath the soil, unseen but unstoppable. The quirky human angle emerges again in chronicles. Philip's own advisors were uneasy. Some whispered that seizing the Templars' wealth was dangerous, that it might invite papal wrath or even divine punishment. One counsellor is said to have remarked that their bells ring in Rome as loudly as in Paris. But Philip, whose dealings with Popes Boniface VIII and Clement V had already shown his willingness to bend or break papal authority, pressed on. To him, bells could be silenced, mist dispersed, steel bent, if only he struck hard enough. The debate remains. Did Philip plan their destruction for years, or did opportunity arise suddenly? Some scholars argue he had been plotting since his disputes with Boniface VIII, eyeing the Templars as a future target. Others believe the charges materialised more hastily, shaped by immediate debt and the chance to act, when Pope Clement V, a Frenchman and Philip's ally, sat on the throne. The answer is hidden in the fog of politics, where secrecy and ambition blur every record. What is certain is that by 1307, Philip was ready. His treasury strained, his authority challenged, his patience thin. He prepared a move both daring and ruthless. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was still confident, attending royal ceremonies, even serving as pallbearer at the funeral of Philip's sister-in-law. Such closeness suggested trust, but trust in the politics of kings is often missed before the storm. The stage is set now for the blow that would fall on a single autumn morning. Bells would toll as usual across France, but beneath their sound, royal officers would be marching. The clang of steel would echo not in defence of pilgrims, but in the arrest of knights. The deep forest of rumour would suddenly crack into fire. Night closes on this chapter with Philip standing in his palace, papers signed, orders sealed. His eyes were fixed not only on wealth but on power, on the chance to show that no order, no matter how ancient or holy, could rival a king. The myths are gathering, the trap is set, and the story now moves inexorably toward Friday the 13th of October 1307. In section 12, we will step into that fateful dawn, when bells tolled across France and the Templars awoke to find themselves surrounded. their obedience turned against them, their steel useless, their fate sealed in ink and chains. The morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, broke like any other in the towns and villages of France. Bells tolled in parish churches to call the faithful to prayer, mist lingered low over fields and rivers, and the clang of steel was just the ordinary sound of guards on patrol or smiths at their anvils. The Templars awoke in their commanderies as they had for nearly 2 centuries, rising before dawn, chanting prayers, breaking fast in silence, preparing for their daily rhythm of work and devotion. None could have guessed that by nightfall their lives would be shattered. The historical fact is stark. On that day, King Philip IV ordered the simultaneous arrest of all Templars across France. Royal officers, armed with sealed warrants, descended upon Templar houses, commanderies and fortresses in a coordinated sweep. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was seized in Paris along with dozens of senior knights. Across the countryside, smaller houses were stormed, brothers bound in chains, their chests and documents confiscated. The scale was unprecedented, a kingdom-wide action carried out with precision. To the public, it seemed as if the ground had shifted overnight, as if the order had gone from sanctified to damned in the toll of a single bell. The charges levelled were shocking. The Templars were accused of heresy, denying Christ, spitting on the cross during initiation, engaging in obscene rituals, even worshipping strange idols such as a bearded head called Baphomet. Some were said to kiss each other in forbidden ways as part of their vows. Others were accused of financial corruption, hoarding wealth, and defying both king and pope. These accusations, read aloud in markets and churches, spread like wildfire, feeding fear and fascination in equal measure. Here enters the quirky detail, one that reveals the dissonance of that day. Chroniclers tell of how Jacques de Molay himself, only days earlier, had served as a pallbearer at the funeral of Philip's sister-in-law. He had walked solemnly beside the king carrying the bier, dressed in his white mantle with the red cross. To see the same man, trusted enough to touch royal sorrow, suddenly shackled in irons was a shock that rippled through Paris. It was as if bells that had rung for mourning now tolled for betrayal. The image lingers, the Grand Master, still bearing dignity, suddenly cast into chains by the very king he had served. But here the mist of uncertainty thickens. Were the confessions that followed genuine admissions of guilt, or the tortured words of men broken by pain? Records show that under interrogation, often involving the rack, the boot, or starvation, many knights confessed to the charges. They admitted to spitting on the cross, to denying Christ, to obscene initiations. Yet later, when the pressure eased, many retracted, insisting they had lied to escape suffering. Scholars still debate the truth. Were there kernels of unorthodox ritual that outsiders misunderstood? Or were the confessions entirely manufactured, extracted by cruelty to justify a king's greed? The documents we possess, often written under duress, leave the question unresolved. The treasure of the Templars, too, vanished into this fog. When officers stormed the Paris temple, they expected to find vaults brimming with gold, enough to erase the crown's debts. Yet the chests were curiously empty. Ledgers showed vast sums owed to the temple, but physical coin and bullion were missing. Rumours swirled that the knights had spirited away their wealth before the arrests, perhaps down hidden tunnels, perhaps onto carts rolling into the night, perhaps even onto ships bound for distant shores. Chroniclers whispered of wagons leaving Paris days before, guarded by silent riders. The treasure became legend, a fortune that never appeared, a phantom hoard that still haunts imaginations. Quirky anecdotes emerged from the arrests. In some villages, peasants were bewildered, for they had known their local Templars as stern but charitable men who gave alms, tended mills, and provided protection. One farmer in Burgundy reportedly asked, "If these knights worshipped demons, why did their barns feed our hungry?" Another tale tells of a child crying when Templar knights were led away, clutching the hem of a white mantle as soldiers pulled it from her hands. Such images clash with the monstrous accusations, underscoring the gap between propaganda and memory. Debate also lingers over how Pope Clement V responded. As head of the Church, he alone could sanction or suppress an order. At first, he protested Philip's actions, insisting that only Rome had authority to judge the Templars. Yet soon, under pressure, Clement issued bulls ordering the arrest of Templars throughout Christendom. Was he coerced by Philip, a French king who dominated his papacy, or was he convinced by the gravity of the charges? Some historians argue Clement acted reluctantly, fearing schism if he opposed the crown. Others believe he seized an opportunity to reassert papal control by absorbing the Templar legacy into other orders. The Pope's motives remain veiled, hidden in that same mist that clouds the entire episode. The arrests of 1307 reverberated far beyond France. In England, Edward II hesitated but eventually obeyed papal orders, seizing Templar houses. In Iberia, local monarchs resisted longer, reluctant to destroy warriors still useful against Muslim forces. Yet even there, suspicion spread, and the once glorious image of the Templars darkened. The bells that had once tolled in their honour now rang for their downfall. Night settles over that autumn day in memory. Picture the Paris Temple, its vaults echoing empty, its knights dragged into cells, its bells silenced under royal decree. Mist coils through the streets as townsfolk whisper of demons and idols, some with fear, some with doubt, some with glee at seeing the mighty brought low. The clang of steel now guards them not as protectors but as captors, and somewhere beyond the city wagons roll, their destination unknown, carrying either treasure or only rumour. If you'd like a calm, deeper part 2 into the afterlives and echoes, subscribe to Serene Myths and share the minute on your clock right now. The story now turns to what followed, the trials that stretched on for years, the confessions and retractions, the executions by fire. Yet even as the order burned, its legend only grew. In section 13, we will step into those trials, where truth and falsehood tangle like roots in a deep forest, and where the fate of the Templars became a drama not only of law, but of memory, myth, and enduring mystery. After the dawn arrests of October 1307, France sank into a long twilight of rumour, testimony, and accusation. The clang of steel was no longer the sound of knights riding to battle, but of shackles being fastened, of swords stripped from scabbards and locked away as evidence. For years the Templars endured not in fortresses but in prisons, where the air was damp, bells tolled for mass far above, and mist seeped through cracks in stone. The order that once carried the aura of invincibility now sat silent, waiting for verdicts that seemed written before the trials began. The historical fact is this. The trials of the Templars lasted from 1307 into the 1310s, spreading beyond France into England, Spain, Italy, and Germany. In France, Philip IV's machinery of justice moved swiftly. Under interrogation, often involving torture, many knights confessed to the charges. Records preserve these words, stark in their brevity. I denied Christ. I spat on the cross. I worshipped an idol. Yet alongside these are equally firm retractions. When not under duress, knights declared their innocence, insisting they had lied to stop their torment. The contradictory testimonies created a fog so thick that even contemporaries doubted what was true. The quirky detail lies in how public these proceedings became. In Paris and other cities, groups of knights were paraded before crowds to confess. One chronicle describes the eerie sight of white mantles stripped from their shoulders, replaced with coarse tunics. Their heads bowed as priests read accusations. Some confessed with trembling voices, others shouted that they were innocent, their words drowned by the tolling of church bells. In one bizarre episode, a knight reportedly laughed during his confession, declaring he would say anything they wished if it would grant him a hot meal. That image, a starving man bargaining with words, captures the absurdity of trials where survival, not truth, dictated testimony. But the most debated point centres on Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master. In 1310 and again in 1314, he stood before panels of inquisitors. At times he confessed. At others, he he retracted, declaring the order pure and loyal to the faith. On March 18th, 1314, he and Geoffrey de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy, were led to a scaffold in Paris. Instead of accepting guilt to secure a lighter sentence, they declared their innocence boldly, proclaiming that the order was free of heresy. The decision sealed their fate. That evening both were burned at the stake on an island in the Seine. Chroniclers describe the fire rising against the night sky, the Grand Master raising his voice in prayer even as flames consumed him. The quirky angle here is a legend that grew around his death. Some accounts claim that as the flames rose, Jacques de Molay cried out, summoning Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to appear before God's judgment within a year. Remarkably, both men did die within 12 months, Clement of illness in April 1314, Philip from a stroke that November. Whether coincidence or providence, the tale stuck like embers carried on the wind. To generations after, it seemed as though the Grand Master's voice, carried by fire and bells, had reached heaven itself. The trials were not confined to France. In England, Edward II at first defended the Templars, noting their reputation for service. But under papal orders, he too allowed investigations. In Iberia, where the orders were still needed for frontier defence, the trials dragged on with less vigour, and many Templar properties were eventually handed over to the Hospitallers. In Germany and parts of Eastern Europe, scepticism prevailed. Some bishops doubted the charges outright. The picture was uneven. In some lands the order was annihilated, in others it faded quietly, absorbed into local institutions. The mist of uncertainty hangs thick over the treasure question. Once again, no vaults of gold appeared. Papal bulls ordered inventories of Templar property, and while estates and goods were seized, the vast cash hoards rumoured by Philip were never found. Did the knights move them before the arrests? Were they exaggerated from the start, inflated by envy into myth? Some historians suspect the treasure had been spent long before, funding fortresses and wars. Others cling to the idea of hidden caches, wagons that rolled out of Paris in the night, ships that sailed under moonlight never to be seen again. The treasure, like their guilt or innocence, dissolved into legend. Yet amid the accusations, one cannot ignore the order's discipline. Even in prison, some Templars kept the rhythm of their vows. One chronicle notes that captives prayed in whispers, timing their devotions by the bells of nearby churches, as though still in commanderies. Another describes prisoners scratching crosses into the walls of their cells, still replaced by fingernails carving devotion into stone. Their silence, once a strength in battle, became a shield against despair. The debated legacy of the trials is whether they destroyed the order or transformed it. Formally, the papal decree of 1312 dissolved the Templars, their properties redistributed, much of it to the Hospitallers. But whispers persisted of knights who escaped to Scotland, Portugal or Switzerland. In Portugal, King Denis reconstituted them as the Order of Christ, which later played a crucial role in the Age of Exploration. In Switzerland, some point to the rise of banking traditions and wonder if Templar discipline left an imprint. In Scotland, legends speak of knights fighting at Bannockburn in 1314, their presence turning the tide. These stories blur fact and fiction, but they reveal how impossible it was to burn the order entirely. Their ashes carried seeds. As night falls in this chapter, imagine Paris in 1314. Mist rising from the Seine, bells tolling for vespers, flames flickering on an island as the Grand Master meets his fate. The people watch, some convinced justice is served, others unsettled by the sight of men dying with prayers on their lips. The clang of steel is absent now, chains clink instead. But in the silence that follows, a legend is born, one that will echo long after kings and popes lie in their graves, and so we move forward, from the flames to the shadows they cast. The trials ended, the order dissolved, but the story did not stop. Section 14 will lead us into the afterlife of the Templars, into Portugal, Scotland and Switzerland, where traces of their legacy lingered like roots in a deep forest, unseen but alive, waiting to surface again. The flames of Paris in 1314 seemed final, Bells tolled as Jacques de Molay and his brothers perished. Their mantles turned to ash, their voices lifted into smoke. To the watching crowd, it must have felt as though the Templars had been erased in fire, their story concluded. Yet history rarely ends so neatly. Like roots in a deep forest, unseen but alive, the Order's legacy pushed outward into new soil. What was dissolved by papal decree reappeared in unexpected places. Portugal, Scotland, Switzerland, each carrying echoes of the temple, sometimes in plain sight, sometimes cloaked in mist. The historical fact is most solid in Portugal. There King Denis, a monarch both pragmatic and poetic, refused to destroy the Templar legacy outright. In 1319, with papal approval, he established the Order of Christ, effectively reconstituting the Templars under a new name. Their estates, wealth, and much of their personnel simply shifted banners. For all practical purposes, the Templars continued, only the Red Cross was altered and the vows reframed. This order would later play a decisive role in Portugal's voyages of discovery. Under Prince Henry the Navigator in the 15th century, the Order of Christ funded expeditions that opened sea routes to Africa, India, and beyond. One could say that the ships carrying steel cannon into the Atlantic also carried the ghost of the temple's discipline, their sails stamped with crosses that echoed the past. The quirky detail from Portugal is how openly the transformation was celebrated. Chronicles describe ceremonies in which knights of the temple simply exchanged their mantles for new ones, their vows adjusted with hardly a pause. A Portuguese poet of the time even joked that the knights changed their name as easily as a man changes his cloak. In one village, peasants continued calling their local commandery the Temple for generations, refusing to adopt the new name. It was as if the people themselves sensed that the change was only skin deep, a fresh coat of paint over the same sturdy stone. The debated point here is whether the Order of Christ truly preserved Templar traditions, or whether it became something entirely different. Some historians argue that the continuity is undeniable, the estates, the discipline, even many of the same men carried on. Others caution that the Order of Christ evolved into something new, more royal than papal, more maritime than monastic. The line between survival and transformation is blurred, lost in the fog of changing centuries. But whether a rebirth or a reinvention, the fact remains that the Templar current flowed strongly through Portugal's rise as a naval power. Northward in Scotland, the picture is murkier, shrouded in mist, thick with legend. According to tradition, some Templars escaped persecution in France and found refuge under Robert the Bruce. Scotland had been excommunicated at the time due to Robert's conflicts with the papacy, making it a convenient sanctuary. The legend reaches its dramatic climax at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Scottish forces faced the English. Some accounts, written much later, claim that mysterious knights rode into battle beside Robert, turning the tide. They were said to be exiled Templars, their steel lances lowered one final time in defence of freedom. The quirky twist in these tales is how colourful they became. One chronicler centuries later described the Templars at Bannockburn as riding like ghosts of the forest, their armour gleaming as if lit from within. Another legend insists that they carried not just lances but relics, perhaps even the Holy Grail hidden away in Scotland. These stories grew so elaborate that they inspired poets, painters, and even modern secret society myths. Whether any Templar knights truly fought at Bannockburn remains unproven, but the legend itself became part of Scotland's national tapestry, a symbol of hidden allies riding from the shadows of history. Debate continues fiercely among historians. Some dismiss the Bannockburn story as a romantic invention, a retroactive attempt to graft Templar mystique onto Scottish triumph. Others allow that a handful of fugitives could have joined Robert's cause, their presence magnified by folklore into a phantom cavalry. The lack of contemporary evidence leaves the question suspended, like a bell whose sound you think you hear in the fog, only to find silence when you listen closely. Further east, in Switzerland, the Templar afterlife took another form. There, In the valleys and mountains, traditions of financial discipline and secrecy blossomed in ways that some linked to the Templar legacy. While no direct order like Portugal's survived, many Swiss cantons absorbed Templar estates and commanderies. Over time, Switzerland became renowned for both its fierce independence and its banking culture. Some have speculated that the Templar methods of managing deposits and transfers left seeds that grew into Swiss financial traditions. It is difficult to prove, yet the parallels, neutrality, secrecy, guardianship of wealth, are tantalizing. The quirky detail from Switzerland is how symbols persisted. In several villages, chapels once run by Templars continued to display the Red Cross for centuries, long after the order's suppression. Locals nicknamed certain barns the Temple Barns, a folk memory that clung to architecture even when official documents erased the name. In one curious case, a farmer in the 17th century complained in court that neighbours accused him of hoarding the temple's treasure in his cellar, proof of how deep the legend had sunk into rural imagination. The debated question in Switzerland is whether the order's traditions genuinely influenced the rise of Swiss banking, or whether the connection is only coincidence. Skeptics argue that financial institutions developed independently, shaped by geography and trade. Believers counter that the Templar estates provided models of organisation and secrecy. As with Scotland and Portugal, certainty remains elusive, swallowed by the deep forest of history where fact and legend intertwine. And so, the Templars lived on after their supposed end, transformed in Portugal, mythologised in Scotland, perhaps echoed in Switzerland. Their ashes became seeds, carried on the wind into new soil. Where kings and popes thought they had extinguished the order, bells continued to toll in distant lands, voices prayed in old chapels, and symbols endured in stone and wax. The paradox deepened. They were dissolved, yet they survived. Burned, yet reborn. Condemned, yet remembered as holy. As night settles on this part of the tale, picture three landscapes. In Portugal, ships unfurl sails marked with crosses, steel cannon ready, bells ringing from coastal monasteries as explorers depart. In Scotland, mist curls around a battlefield where ghostly knights are said to have charged. In Switzerland, quiet valleys hold barns and chapels where the Red Cross still flickers in memory. The Templars, though broken, still move like shadows through the centuries. From here, the story drifts towards symbols and memory. For beyond their estates and legends, the Templars also left behind shapes, codes, and geometry that some say reveal hidden knowledge. Section 15 will lead us into this realm of patterns, of crosses, circles, and stars, that kept the order alive not in armies or banks but in imagination, etched into stone and whispered through time. Even after their arrests, their trials, and their supposed dissolution, the Templars refused to vanish completely. Their castles crumbled, their ledgers scattered, their mantles burned, but their symbols endured. In stone carvings, in chapel windows, in the geometry of forgotten maps, traces of their presence lingered like roots beneath a deep forest, subtle yet persistent. If one listens closely, bells seem to toll faintly from those ruins, carrying echoes of an order that learned long ago how to speak through image as much as through word. The historical fact is that Templar sites across Europe preserve distinct markings. In old commanderies in France and Spain, one can still see the Red Cross carved into keystones, etched onto barn walls, or painted into faded frescoes. In churches once under their patronage, circular designs appear. Some scholars call them Templar wheels, rosettes of interlaced lines that may have been mere ornament but seem curiously precise. In Portugal, in the fortress of Tomar, the great convent of Christ, built on former Templar foundations, displays not only the Red Cross, but also intricate symbolic motifs, stars, suns, and geometric lattices. These are not inventions of legend. They are stones one can still touch, carvings still visible under centuries of dust. The quirky detail lies in how ordinary folk responded to these symbols long after the order was gone. In some French villages, mothers warned children not to play near chapels marked with the cross, whispering that the temple ghosts lingered there. In Spain, shepherds used circular carvings as good luck charms, tracing them with fingers before journeys. One curious record from Italy even describes peasants baking loaves stamped with a crude Templar cross, convinced the bread would keep away wolves. What had once been marks of discipline and authority became in folklore charms against misfortune. Yet here the mist thickens. Did the Templars embed deeper meanings into their symbols, or are modern imaginations reading too much into them? The debate is fierce. Some historians argue that the crosses, circles and rosettes were merely decorative, typical of medieval art. Others, especially esoteric writers, claim that the Templars encoded knowledge in geometry, ratios linked to the golden mean, alignments that echoed astronomical patterns, or diagrams that hinted at sacred architecture stretching back to Solomon's temple. The very absence of definitive records invites speculation, and speculation has blossomed into entire traditions of hidden codes and secret wisdom. Consider the octagon, a shape often associated with Templar chapels. The Church of Leon in France, the Rotunda of Tomar in Portugal and other sites show unusual octagonal designs. Some scholars connect this to the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem where the Templars once lodged. Was it imitation? Was it homage? Or was it an intentional symbol of unity? The number 8 signifying resurrection and eternity. The answers blur into conjecture, but the shapes remain, etched in stone long after parchment decrees have turned to dust. The quirky side of geometry emerges in small, almost playful details. In England, at Temple Church in London, visitors still marvel at the round nave, said to echo the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. But one medieval guidebook jokes that the round shape also made it easier to hear confessions, since whispers carried oddly well across the curve. In another case, a mason's mark at a Templar site in Germany shows not a solemn cross but what looks like a child's doodle of a star, crooked and uneven. Were the masons leaving signatures, or were they playing at secrets we now overinterpret? The line between reverence and humour was thinner than we often assume. The debated point is whether later groups, Freemasons, Rosicrucians and other secret societies, truly inherited these symbols or merely borrowed them centuries later. Freemasonry, for instance, revels in geometry and compasses and squares in the lore of Solomon's temple. Many point to Templar ruins as inspiration. But was there real continuity? A line of transmission from the 14th century knights into later lodges? Some argue yes, citing similarities in symbols and rituals. Others dismiss it as romantic invention, a case of later groups cloaking themselves in borrowed mystique. The truth is again wrapped in fog, bells tolling faintly across centuries without ever clarifying their origin. What is certain is that the Templar symbols have proved immortal in imagination. The two knights on one horse, once a simple emblem of poverty, became a mystery in itself. The red cross, plain as it was, turned into a mark of hidden power. Circles, stars, octagons, all drew interpretations like moths to candlelight. Even today, tourists in Tamar trace their fingers along stone carvings, as if by touch they might unlock some secret left by monk knights long gone. And perhaps that was the true genius of the order. Their castles could be torn down, their ledgers burned, their leaders executed, but symbols are harder to kill. A stone cross in a village wall, a round church echoing Jerusalem, a rumour of geometry linked to heaven's design. These linger. They drift like mist through history, reappearing whenever imagination hungers for mystery. Picture now an old Templar chapel at dusk. The air is cool, bells from a distant monastery echo faintly, and in the dim light a circle of carved stone glows with shadows. Is it mere decoration? Or is it a fragment of a hidden code, a whisper from men who believed that steel could guard the body, but symbols could guard the soul? The answer depends on who looks, and how. Thus, the Templars endure not only in estates or chronicles, but in imagination, in geometry, in the stories we tell ourselves about hidden orders and eternal codes. Their symbols are not explanations, they are invitations, doors left ajar for those who wish to wander, and wander we must, for the story is drawing to its close. The bells have tolled through conquest and dissolution, through trials and rumours, through legends of treasure and codes in stone. Now they toll more softly, carrying us into the final section, where the pace will slow, the imagery deepen, and the Templars' long shadows settle into stillness. Section 16 will be our wind down, where the clang of steel fades into silence, the mist closes around us, and the deep forest offers rest. The story of the Templars, stretched across centuries of steel and parchment, of fortresses and flames, of symbols and silence, now draws toward its close. We have followed them from the bloodied stones of Jerusalem in 1099, through the hush of 9 years by the Temple Mount, through councils and papal bulls, through banks and castles, through rivalry and obedience, through debt and betrayal, through arrests and trials, through fire and ashes, and into the lingering afterlives of Portugal, Scotland and Switzerland. Their saga has been both fact and legend, solid as stone and elusive as mist. But now, as night deepens, we let the pace slow, as if walking into a deep forest, where bells ring softer and steel lies quiet, sheathed and forgotten. The historical fact that remains, unshaken, is that the Templar Order was officially dissolved in 1312 by Pope Clement V, under pressure from Philip's Seftor. Their properties were transferred mostly to the Hospitallers, their leaders executed, their name tarnished. The institution that once bestrode Christendom like a bridge of stone and paper was dismantled, piece by piece. This is the firm ground beneath the legends, the final decree that silenced their corporate voice. And yet, as we have seen, history's decrees never quite silence the echoes that ring in human imagination. The quirky detail, softer now in tone, comes from a parish in rural France, centuries after the suppression. Villagers still called a certain field the Temple Meadow, even though no knight had tilled it for generations. Children played there, whispering stories of hidden treasure, and elders told of hearing bells toll faintly underground on certain nights. The church may have erased the order, kings may have burned their leaders, but folk memory clung to them like ivy on old stone. Sometimes the strangest survivals are not in parchment or fortress, but in the mouths of villagers, carrying fragments of a story into the quiet rhythm of daily life. And the debated point, gentle now as it drifts through fog, is what the Templars truly were in essence. Were they visionaries, forging the first multinational institution, disciplined, courageous, devoted to their vows? Were they corrupted, as their enemies claimed, swollen by wealth and secrecy until pride brought their fall? Or were they merely human, flawed and faithful, greedy and generous, holy and ambitious all at once? Scholars argue, novels embellish, films dramatize. But the truth may be simpler and more elusive. They were men bound by time and circumstance, caught in the currents of history, shaping and being shaped, their legacies slipping between fact and dream. The mist refuses to clear entirely, and perhaps it never will. So let us step back now into the forest of symbols where their story has always belonged. Picture a ruined commandery at dusk. Stones crumble, ivy crawls across broken arches, owls stir in towers where once bells rang. The clang of steel has faded. The armoury lies empty. Yet in imagination one can still hear hoofs striking stone, banners fluttering, prayers whispered in midnight halls. History has fallen silent, but memory fills the silence with echoes. The deep forest of time holds them gently. The Templars become not only themselves but also what each generation needs them to be. Protectors, traitors, saints, heretics, bankers, mystics, ghosts. Their paradox lives on because it speaks to our own. We too wrestle with steel and parchment, with law and freedom, with power and humility. In them we see both warning and inspiration. And now, as the tale settles into stillness, we return to the motifs that have carried us. Steel, once bright in battle, now lies rusting, a relic in the soil. Bells, once tolling triumph and doom, now drift faintly in the night air, their sound blending with wind through leaves. Mist gathers softly, not as menace, but as comfort, a veil that covers what is finished and makes the landscape gentle again. And the deep forest, vast and dark, becomes not a place of fear, but a place of rest, where roots hold the earth steady and branches weave a canopy of peace. Close your eyes and picture it. A quiet glade deep in that forest. The last candle burns low, its flame bending, its wax pooling. The bells in the distance grow faint, softer with each toll, as though even they are tired. Steel lies forgotten beside the hearth, its sharp edge dulled, its weight surrendered. Mist curls around the trees, cool and tender, wrapping the world in silence. And there, in the hush, the Templars finally sleep. Not as warriors or bankers or conspirators, but simply as men, their story now a dream that drifts into the night. The forest sleeps, the bells grow faint, the mist settles, and so too do we. If this helped you drift, a quiet like or subscribe is enough. Leave the time you're resting at and sleep well. Good night.